Hey everybody, how you doing today? My name is Walt, and I am here to inform you about the career of everybody's favorite top hat wearing, beard rocking, notoriously honest President of the United States. That's right, today we'll be talking about Rutherford B. Hayes. Seriously though, when my hometown of Delaware, Ohio put up this statue, this beautiful bronze likeness of old Ruthie here, I thought to myself, how good of a president could he have possibly been? I mean, a radical Republican, Reconstruction era, an era, the 1870s, notorious for its corruption, for its patronage in politics, for the catastrophe that was Reconstruction, followed by the catastrophe that was the end of Reconstruction. How great of a president could he have possibly been? How could his merits have possibly been even close to his faults in an era as mired in badness and not good types of political intrigue as the 1870s? Now, where Hayes finds his identity as a president and as a politician is very much in his moderate nature and in his inability to purely toe the party line. Now, he was pretty much a party radical Republican during the early Reconstruction. But by the time he was president, a lot of his views and a lot of his policies reflected a more moderate approach to politics, for better and for worse. Now, before we proceed, it's important that y'all understand the politics of the day. 1876 was the year that Rutherford became president. Was very, very different to what we have today. When I say radical Republican, that platform and that party is vastly different from what you might call a radical Republican today. Same with the Democrats, unless they're Dixiecrats. Those are the same as they've always been. And by weird, I mean they're really, really racist. Like, to this day. Not a lot of them left, but oh my, oh pumpkin pie. And also most of them are like Emperor Palpatine aged, Yoda aged, super racist. Yeah. As we discuss the life and the career of Rutherford B. Hayes, I think it's important to understand that he was not a very popular president among the rest of the political body, but he was a relatively well-liked president by the common people during his actual presidential run. Even among people who disagreed with him, he was relatively well respected because of his moderate views. If I were to sum up his character as a person, rather than just as a politician or as a policymaker, I'd say the best way to do it is think of the way our country portrays George Washington, right? And now I disagree with that. George Washington was a very flawed person. Leave in the comments below if you want me to make a video taking down the founding father of America itself. That will surely get me lots and lots of fans. But the way I've read it described, I believe in either Hoogenboom or Tefousse, was the integrity of Washington and the honesty of Lincoln. I've also heard his political career compared to John Adams, like the first Adams, not Quincy Adams, the Quinns boy himself. I don't know about that so much. I'm not a huge expert on Adams' career, but I can tell you that Rutherford always had a sense of character. Even with all of his flaws, he was always striving to do what was right, and he always had a sense of faith in his country and in people in general that you don't see a lot of people having at all in real life. And it's kind of refreshing. But it also backfires on him in one really huge way, No spoilers. I'll get to that later. It's going to be one of the big topics I talk about. Just keep that in your mind, that having faith in people comes back to bite him in the beard. There, that's appropriate, right, Mom? I didn't say the A word. I didn't swear. My mom is happy now. Chapter 1. The early stuff. Let's start this show where it all began. Back at the very beginning of Hayes' life, the start of everyone's real and actual life, where it actually matters, where it actually begins. One's attendance of college. Now, Hayes had attended a preparatory school in Connecticut, the Webb School, so I guess he must have been ready to graduate from Kenyon College in Ohio at the age of 20 in the year 1842. He studied law at a firm for about a year. I'll put the name at the bottom of the screen. I don't remember it. And then in the year 1843, he graduated from Harvard with a full law degree. He practiced law after that. It was pretty cool. Now, first he went to Lower Sandusky, Ohio, and he practiced law there. Smaller community, not a lot of people. His main source of business was his uncle Sardis, where he did real estate law. Now, where you can really see Hayes' character coming through is during his later years, during his Corwin years, Corwin law firm years, that is. Not only did he represent fugitive slaves, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 was in full effect during the 1850s. Who'da thunk it? And a large part of his notoriety came from that. That's the main reason why the Republican Party viewed him as a desirable in the first place. He transferred from being a purely commercial lawyer to being a commercial lawyer who occasionally did criminal cases during this time. And the criminal cases he tried were actually pretty well in the spotlight. The tragic tale of the Nancy Farrer case. Maybe it's Farrer, I don't really know. His first major spotlight criminal case was a case that I'll refer to as the Nancy Farrer case. Now, Nancy Farrer, or Farrer, I might be saying it wrong, who knows? Only God knows, and Nancy Farrer, and probably her parents. But Nancy Farrer was a poisoner. She worked as a nurse during the 1840s and 50s, and in 1851, she poisoned a family that she was in the service of as a nurse. It is thought that she actually poisoned the family that she was working at before because the mother and her baby child had died in a similar way to the family that she poisoned with arsenic. The Nancy Farrer case, it was a pretty high-profile case in Cincinnati. You need to remember that at the time it was a city of some 120,000 people. So having a small string of murders was a big deal. Nancy Farrer was a live-in nurse of sorts. To my understanding, her job also very much involved cleaning up around the house and just taking care of household chores, though she's most commonly referred to as a nurse. In 1851, Nancy Farrer entered the employment of the Forrest family in eastern Cincinnati. Later that year, or not too much later, I might add, she poisoned several members of the family. It is thought that she poisoned the whole family. We're not sure. The poison most certainly didn't kill the whole family. She successfully murdered the mother, referred to only as Mrs. Forrest. There are apparently no records of what her first name was. Her baby child, who also doesn't have a first name, and her son, Jeremy, or Jimmy, or some boring J name. He deserved to die, if you ask me, having a boring J name. Why couldn't they have named him Jaharis, or Johan or Jiggly. That's a real name, right? Jiggly McStuffins, my childhood friend. Totally not made up. Also, it's worth pointing out that she likely poisoned other people in the past. Very conspicuously, the last people she worked for, a Mrs. Green and her baby, both seem to have died of arsenic poisoning, though they had no real proof of that. The only thing she was ever brought to trial for was the murder of young Forrest. Now, an important fact of this case is at the time, people had a certain set of beliefs about skull shape relating to intelligence. This science has been entirely debunked. It's like not a real thing. Your skull shape doesn't affect how well you think. It's referred to as phylactery? Philotomy? Philosophy? Dr. Phil! This was very much used in the case to try and demonstrate Nancy's insanity. She had a very wide brow, like a freakishly wide brow. She had a really funny looking face. And it was really easy for them to persuade the jury that something was wrong with her. Now, that didn't matter. At the time, insanity pleas weren't much of a thing. Not long before this, in Britain is where the McNaughton rules, I want to say, were brought into effect. And those are rules and regulations regarding the sanity of an individual. It's a whole thing. There was a guy who killed the Prime Minister's assistant, I want to say, because he thought that there was a plot against his life. And it's a story for a different video that I'll probably make eventually. But needless to say, these standards, or any standard, didn't really exist in the United States at the time. So Hayes kind of did an unfounded thing while representing Nancy Ferrer and tried to push for an insanity plea. Didn't work. They were still going to hang her. Except the trial was also filled with just stupid errors. The most garish of which is that during deliberations, there are 2 separate times when people in deliberations communicated with people outside of deliberations. Through the courthouse window. As in, there were conversations about the trial going on through a window. Now, if you know anything about serving on a jury or how that works, like I do, me, a professional of juryology, as they call me, PhD, put the diploma up in the case here. I'll replace drink or treat with that. That's an outdated decoration. The point is, that's bad. So he appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court to have that verdict undone. And basically it was reduced to just life in an insane asylum. Basically, not guilty by merit of insanity. We don't really know what happened to Nancy Ferrer after this. I've seen a couple of claims of specific asylums that she got sent to. I don't know which one. None of the books I've read have been able to say which one. I'll include a couple good sources for researching Nancy Ferrer and the Nancy Ferrer case. The next case that Hayes did was also a poisoner. And he did a couple of other murder cases that were a little lower profile than that. But I think the Nancy Ferrer case is important to Hayes because while he was governor, he put funding toward asylums. He put funding toward the expansion of different insane asylums in Ohio, as well as putting funding toward a reform school for girls and other such things. You know, it affected his worldview on the less fortunate of society. Though it is worth noting that he totally was arguing someone's intelligence based on the shape of their skull. Whether that actually colored his opinion or not, I can't say. I didn't know him personally. I don't think he was writing anybody about that. He himself being like a really strong abolitionist. Related to abolitionism, At the same time, in the 1850s, he met and married his wife, Lucy Hayes, who was a very strong abolitionist and a teetotaler. So it's fair to say that her very extreme beliefs on the subject likely affected his legal practice and likely affected his political views in the future. Lucy, during the Civil War, once wrote Hayes saying that Lincoln was not anti-slavery enough for her tastes, due to the way the Emancipation Proclamation just sort of freed slaves in conquered territory, not territory that had been conquered. I did that backwards. It freed slaves that were in the unconquered part of this. My point is that there were issues with the way the proclamation was done. Chapter 2. A Political Beginning. In 1958, Hayes' career as a lawyer would change forever when he was nominated to the position of city solicitor by the City Council of Cincinnati. Now, a city solicitor is sort of the chief law officer person of a city. Basically a lot of real estate and commercial type of stuff, as opposed to a lot of really serious, super dark crimes like he seemed to be getting up to before that. Now, the reason he was favored for this position was for his notoriety and for the fact that he represented fugitive slaves. And the Council of Cincinnati was Republican at the time, very Republican. In fact, in '59, when it came time for actual election of this position, it is notable that he was elected by popular vote as well. So I guess he had some good clout in the city of Cincinnati. And he served in this position until '61, when he lost the position to a sweep of a Democratic movement called the Know Nothings. The Know Nothings are neat. I do not remember why they are called Know Nothings, but they were shit. Like, imagine like the most stereotypically racist bunch of blokes, and you've got the movement that took over Ohio for a while there, at least the Cincinnati region. Xenophobic, anti-immigration, nativist, which meant something very different. Their party used to be called the Native American Party. Before that term meant something very different. But the Know Nothings, not good, bad, come in, make career go away for Hayes for a while. But it was very convenient, because not long after that, approximately 3 days after he started practicing law regularly again, the Civil War started, and he ended up joining. Chapter 3. Hayes in the American Civil War, or the 23rd is the word. So he started off in the Ohio Guard, right? The Ohio Home Guard, the 23rd Ohio. And not long after that, or well, months after that, realistically, but not long getting a whole bunch of people ready for war-wise, Hayes was deployed with all his lads in what is currently Western Virginia. Now, Hayes' service was in like the Fayette area, for me to be accurate. He fought in a number of different battles and served in a couple of campaigns, but I don't want to get into too much detail about them because that could easily gobble up the intent of this video essay, which is more about Hayes than about his battles that he was and was not part of. But I'll go over them real quick just to give you an idea of where he was and what he did. Of course, he started off in Virginia, right, the western part of it, the gateway to Ohio. His first skirmish with the Confederates, the 23rd's first skirmish, would have been Quarterfex Ferry in September 10th of 1961. Not a lot to say about it. It was a skirmish, the Union won, on to the next one. Now all this, of course, just makes him higher profile back in Ohio, and it makes him more important to people of a military bend, you know, the war heroes of the Union who would later influence politics in the North. The Second Battle of Bull Run, August 28th to 30th, he was called into the battle, but the 23rd didn't reach Bull Run in time to fight there, so it doesn't really count. But the Wikipedia mentions it, so I'm going to mention it so nobody's like, ha, the Battle of Bull Run, though. He was not there. He did not participate. He just headed towards it and never got there because he was too slow. South Mountain, the important one, where Hayes actually got injured. Aside from the time he sprained his ankle and like an empty round hit his face or something. The real time he got injured. Took a bullet for his cause. South Mountain, September 14th. The 23rd is there. They're the main force up against those Confederates. And they're charging up a hill. And Hayes gets shot. Hits him in the arm, it breaks it in 2 places, he's bleeding, it probably nicked his artery, you know, real lightweight injury. But he has to lay down for a while, his second in command has to take over and lead. They end up pulling back, and he's laying on the ground, and he gets all salty, and is like, hello, 23rd Men, are you going to leave your major for the enemy? And so a bunch of his men are like, we'll go help him. But like the Confederates are like, look at these nerds. I had to reload. It took like half a minute for them to reload. But and you know, so they had to fall back, and eventually an officer had to come out and get him. It was a whole thing. He did try after the first time he got shot and had to lay down to get back up and lead, but he was too weak. You know, it was weak, cowardly, wimpy Hayes was like, oh, my arm, it's broken. Oh, I'm probably going to bleed to death. Oh. Now, later, when he was like getting treated by his uncle Webb, I forget his first name. He got the job through Hayes, basically. He was a surgeon. He was like, oh, it's a life-threatening injury. You're probably gonna die or lose your arm. But I know the truth. Hayes just didn't want to fight in Antietam. Now, Antietam happened while he was wounded, you know, so he wasn't there. 23rd was there. It was a big deal. But Hayes, no, he's chilling with his family that went out of their way to find him and come visit him while he was sick because he could die. It's garbage. Garbage, I tell you. Really though, authentically, it was a very dangerous wound. He could have very well lost his arm or his life. And it says a lot that his wife went through so much trouble to find him and be with him in his time of need. He was sort of sheltered in the westerly Virginia-y region during that time. The next major conflict he had was against a Morgan Hunt. Well, guys, you're just gonna have to bear with me here. I got his name all mixed up. It's actually Jonathan Hunt Morgan. So just keep that in mind. I'll keep his face up for a little bit so you can at least remember his face properly without getting it swapped in your brain, the way I apparently did. He launched a very terrifyingly successful raid into Ohio at the time. And Hayes and the 23rd, as well as a couple of other regiments that never seem to be mentioned by name in any source I can find. It's out there, I'm having a hard time getting the specifics. And it's not that important. Basically, long story short, they chase him down. They manage to confront him at Buffington Island, right on the border between Ohio and Virginia. And they managed to beat him by basically surrounding him. About 1,500 people were captured from the Confederate side, and about 700, including Hunt, escaped. Now, this is considered by some to be like a huge failing, at least according to Tefousse, and to a lesser extent, what's his name? Hoogenboom. Hoogenboom barely mentions it. If he does at all, I don't recall. But Tefousse acts like it's a great tragedy that Hunt escaped. And I mean, they captured twice as many people after the battle, so I don't know. And he never raided in Ohio again. It was a very successful defense, I think, and an interesting episode. Like, you don't think of Ohio as being at the heart of the Civil War, but it was always across a thin membrane, right? Easily the war could have spilled into Ohio. Instead, you have a lot of battles taking place in Virginia, in Pennsylvania, and I promised I wouldn't talk too much about the battles. Moving on. Shenandoah happened between May and October of '54. The Shenandoah campaign is a pretty sticky subject. A lot of bad stuff happened during that campaign. It would not be fair to say that Hayes or any of the Union generals or even any of the Confederate generals involved had a lot to do with it. There was a lot of raiding that happened. There was a lot of deserters raiding after the area had already been raided. It was a very messy sort of campaign. But it more or less brought an end to the war earlier than it might have otherwise ended. And it's here where Hayes got most of his recognition by people. He rubbed elbows with a lot more officers, with a different crowd of officers than he was in West Virginia, around Fayette, rather. And it's part of what boosted him into fame. It's after and toward the end of the Shenandoah campaign that he got his promotions, right? He was a brigadier general during the Shenandoah. And at the end, they made him a brevet something general. I forget the term for it. It was a bunch of fancy brouhaha. Didn't mean anything. It was his end of war promotion to say that he did a good job. The only thing that really happened of note during the Shenandoah regarding him is he did break his ankle. He didn't break his ankle, he sprained it and got hit by like an empty round or something. And it didn't hurt him. He just had a sprained ankle. He got to ride around on a horse anyway, so not a big deal. I'm sorry, I did a goofy face. I don't mean to make fun of Hayes' strength again, but twisted ankle? What, did his ankle just have weak tendons? Oh, what is he, Achilles? Got hit in the Achilles heel by an empty round? Whatever that's supposed to mean. Fucking Wikipedia. Anyway, the surrender of the Civil War happened in '65. Spring. May, I think. May 9th, to be specific, because I wrote it down. May 9th, the surrender happens, the war is over, everybody gets to go home. And this is a good thing, because Hayes may or may not have remotely run for Congress during this time. Chapter 4, in which Hayes experiences intense Congress. It's important to know that the way elections were run did not involve a lot of hands-on campaigning. Today, if you didn't see Trump or Hillary or whoever's in the running these days, I mean, like Emperor Snoot or whoever is running for politics in the future, if you didn't see them, it would be weird. But back at the time, campaigning was done more through proxy. This is for a couple of reasons. A, traveling was a lot more expensive and difficult. B, there was a system of patronage in place at the time where it was common to expect your political allies and underlings to campaign for you in exchange for civil service jobs, cabinet positions, etc., etc. For example, Hayes did some campaigning for the governor of Ohio at the time, or the Republican candidate for governor of Ohio during his time as solicitor. This is a really common practice. It was a really corrupt practice that we'll get into soon. But it's important to note that he did this entirely remotely. He did not sacrifice his time on the campaign, his time serving the Union Army to campaign. In fact, he was very adamant about not resigning from his position. When his constituents encouraged him to in order to do some campaigning, his response was this: "Any officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped." Needless to say, he successfully became a congressman in '66. The year is 1865, and Rutherford B. Hayes has just been selected by the people of Ohio to represent them in the House of Congress. Now, this is a very important time in American history. It's the end of the Civil War. Things need put back together. You have two populations that need brought back into American society, into the government's fold, so to speak. You have ex-rebels who supported the South and lived in the South and fought for the South that need brought back into the representative system. And you have freedmen who have never had any level of suffrage before in the South, who all of a sudden have suffrage and are being recognized as citizens. Ideally as full citizens, but that takes a while for them to actually get around to, as we shall see. I'd say, other than suffrage, the big issue that Hayes faced over his career in Congress, which was like a term and a half, was Andrew Johnson. Now, Andrew Johnson, aside from being one stubborn son of a bitch and learning how to read as a grown-ass man as opposed to as a child like everyone else, did not have a lot of positive traits about him. He kind of looks like Ebenezer Scrooge. He was a bona fide racist. He was stubborn as fuck when he didn't need to be. And in general, just did a lot to hamper Reconstruction efforts. While the 100% gung-ho ways of the radical Republicans of the time was probably not a lot better in its ultimate practice. After all, there was a whole school of thought about the South that was their conquered territory, don't bring them back in as states. Which makes sense. We were just at war with half of the country. It makes sense that some people would feel that way. But that's probably not the best thing that could have possibly happened. What we got was probably not the best either. Johnson fought any kind of Reconstruction. He was stubborn, and he held to what he thought, I guess, were Lincoln's ideals in a lot of ways. But ultimately, I'd say his feud with Congress is like more of a bad guy look for him than otherwise. He is the first president to ever be impeached, unsuccessfully, mind you. Anyway, that was the big conflict of that period. Aside from that, suffrage and Reconstruction were a perpetual struggle for like a decade. Government in the South was sort of enforced at the point of a bayonet. They basically forced states to recognize the rights of freedmen, to recognize the rights of freedmen, and not to murder freedmen. They did this with force for the most part, that gradually declined over time. And that was sort of what's going on in the backdrop. But meanwhile, in Ohio and in other places in the North, but mostly in Ohio, they had a lot of problems with suffrage. Ohio didn't like it. You got to remember that as Hayes was leaving his solicitor position, he was being pushed out by some very radical Democrats. And this is during the Civil War, during the height of a dislike that would have been experienced by Democrats. But before I continue, I think it's important that I note that Democrat and Republican are not the same thing now that they were then. The Democratic platform of the time, with its states' rights and its general conservatism, was much different from the Republican platform. For one, the Republican platform at the time had moderates that typically had a Whig origin, and it had more liberal sorts who were on board for the social justice shit. Yeah, all these SJWs, you know them, always wanting suffrage for women and slaves and equal rights and fair immigration laws. Man, these fucking people. Essentially, rules changed very much in the 150 years that have passed since. More than that, but like 150 years, give or take. So Hayes served in Congress through the impeachment of Andrew Johnson, the failed impeachment, and he didn't do a lot that is of special note in comparison to the rest of his career. He was always hugely pro-suffrage, always. You got to remember that the same decade saw, 15th Amendment before they had the 14th, but that's during the Civil War. But basically, that's the flavor of Congress. Congress also at this point in time was very powerful. It had a lot more power than the president in the years following the Civil War. It was sort of disbalancing the power, and their influence was kind of incredible. Chapter 5, in which Hayes proves that he might have been the 19th century equivalent to the Terminator by becoming the governor of his home state. The state he moved to after he was born. So the year is 1867, and Hayes is like, well, Congress was a lot of work. And it was. He worked pretty hard during this period of time. He didn't want it, so he became governor of Ohio instead. He ran against a guy called Allen G. Thurman. His big platform was anti-suffrage. He's like, man, these black people in Ohio should not be able to vote. It's just a bad deal for all us people who dislike black people. We don't want to share our voting spaces with them. What if they give us melanin? I don't know. I don't know how Thurman thought. He did a lot of stuff. He was a congressman before that. He would go on to be justice and also like an assistant justice. For a time, he was actually number 2 dude in Congress, I think after his failed governorship run. He was the, what's the word? It's some hoity-toity Latin word. I'll put it up on the screen. You guys can laugh at me for not being able to remember it. It's like Presidente Inaugurarum, hates black people, whatever his job was. The office that Allen G. Thurman held in the United States Senate was actually President pro tempore of the United States Senate. And he held it in 79 and 80. It's worth noting that while I kind of frame him in a little bit of a racist light, he definitely does not seem to, based on his voting history, support slavery so much as suffrage, based on my understanding of his voting history. For example, he opposed a bill which would have, supported a bill that would have prevented slavery in newly gained territory from Mexico after the Mexican-American War. Which is a small gain, to say the least. But it's worth noting that even bad apples apparently have spots that are not rotten. and can be used in delicious quince pies. Delicious quince pies. Pie. To make you understand how split Ohio was on its values at the time, there was a sort of movement. There were a series of protests. Women would dress in white and carry around signs that said, "Fathers, save us from the Negro vote." Maybe not in those exact words, but that's what they're all quoted as saying. Maybe they had more than one sign. I'd like to think so. I'd like to think some of them had like more colorful signs, and there was occasionally that one person who just brought a sign and never got to write on it. I'd like to think a few of them couldn't read. Maybe that explained why they were against black people being able to vote. Point being, it's a very close situation. Hayes, in his different campaigns for governor, did a little worse as time went on. His first two votes were pretty good. Like his first run, a little close. Second run, better. Third run, a little worse. And then his fourth run, did he have a fourth run? Nope. But the point is, over time, Hayes always struggled with his elections. Chapter 6, in which the Electoral College of the United States has a really bad couple of months. President of the United States, 1876. Who are you going to be? Who are you going to win the vote? We don't know. Let's find out. First, the Republicans. They thought, let's figure this out. Let's get some nominations. They had a bunch of them, like an unhealthy amount of them, like a 2020 Democratic race amount of nominees. But there are only three that are important. There's your boy, Rutherford B. Hayes. There's your boy, Roscoe Conkling, notorious politician, a senator, man of New York. He's the big man, sort of a bossy dude. He's sits atop a pyramid, a patronage, corruption, and power. Very influential senator, very important. He'll be very important later too, again and again and again. Always a thorn in the side of American pride. There is Thomas Blaine of Maine. He's Blaine of Maine, I know. I didn't make his decisions for him. His parents named him Thomas Blaine, and he has to live with that decision in Maine, apparently. But another big contender. He's a little important later too, but he's a little less important than Conkling because he stops being a monumental pain in the ass a lot sooner. And then you have Grant. Grant was going to run again, but he didn't because he realized that was a terrible decision. He ran again after Hayes. It was still a terrible decision. Case closed for Grant. May his presidency rest in peace. Never to rise again. Ultimately, it boiled down to Hayes because he was sort of a favorite. He was sort of okay with everyone who didn't think he was the best, right? He was pretty moderate, so he could win over a lot of the liberals among the Republican Party of the day, especially those who wanted civil service reform, of which there was a pretty large chunk. Not the majority, I wouldn't say, but there was definitely a civil service movement in politics at the time that was just getting its feet into the mud of actually making change. So he was a good pick for them. He was a good pick for the moderates too, because he was a moderate. He was a good pick for a lot of those who had military backgrounds because he was a war hero. He had a lot going for him that made him ultimately the one that they all decided to vote for. He had some stiff competition. A lot of the people he was up against, especially Blaine and a couple of the others, had a good chance to overtake him if political winds went a little different way. But he was a well-backed nominee. He was not a nominee that the Republican Party was meh about. He had the Republican support from the people, from the electors, etc., etc., etc. Now, Where it gets sticky is he ends up running against Samuel J. Tilden. Now, Tilden is pretty much the Southern Democrat of his day, right? He did have one thing in common with Hayes, and that was he was a very accomplished lawyer before he got into politics. Aside from that, I'd say their platforms are entirely juxtaposed. Tilden liked greenbacks, and Hayes liked gold. Tilden disliked suffrage, and Hayes liked it. Tilden thought the South should be free of the Northern thumb, and Hayes actually probably agreed with that one, within reason. Though most of his career, you wouldn't think that. He's about to surprise us all with decisions about Reconstruction that will shock you and America to its very core and will continue to affect America for like 1 billion years or something. Let's find out in the next video. I kid. We continue. Chapter 6.5 The Dispute. So, the first disputed vote, and the most delicious and spicy, is the one from Oregon. Oregon had an issue with one of its electors presumably profiting from his choice. So the governor did something he wasn't supposed to do and tweaked the vote to be Democrat instead of Republican. It was weird. No more details needed. It was bad and they had to fix it. 7 of the votes came from South Carolina. South Carolina is an interesting case in that it had so much fraud that an extra % of potential voters showed up to vote in the election. There were a lot of cases of threats against Republican voters and freedmen voters, etc., etc., etc. You need to remember at this point that there was a great reduction in the amount of protection available at polls. There was a military presence, but it was not as widespread as it could have been to have the optimal effect. So basically it wasn't getting its job done while it was there. Similar case in Louisiana where they had another 8 electoral votes that were disputed. Fraud wasn't as bad, but there was a lot of fraud, a lot of threats, etc., etc. Similar in Florida where they had 4 votes. Chapter 6.5 Point 5 in which the dispute reaches its worst state of ill repute. 20 votes. They're disputed. I know what you're thinking. Just throw them out. Get rid of them. We don't need those votes. But you're wrong. Because Uncle Sam was like, not today. And so Congress, which was pretty Democrat-leaning at the time, and Grant had to come to a very special settlement, a very special compromise. And their compromise was to create a team, an elite A team of people, 8 Republicans, 8 Democrats, 1 independent thinker who got bribed, and as a result he got booted, and then they put a Republican with an independent mindset into his place. Their pictures will be alternating on the screen beautifully right now. Ooh, look at them, aren't they beautiful? Anyway, basically they went to work and they investigated all the votes. And you gotta remember, Hayes had to win all of these to win. So having that extra Republican push guy probably got him the election, because he won all of them suckers. All of them suckers, even the Oregon one, even the shady Oregon one. Now, there is some argument as to how much corruption and fidgeting went into making sure Hayes got the votes. Though it is fair to say he probably didn't have much of a hand in it, the process of him getting the votes at all. He was pretty indifferent based on his correspondence with friends and family. He was pretty indifferent as to whether or not he won the election. He would have been satisfied with a loss. He was as ready to retire as he could have been, all things considered. But he would have been happy to take the office as well, and was. Tilden, there's no evidence that I've seen that he actually participated in any corruption, but he did have people in his circle who were definitely participating in it. Though Hayes had a few people in his circle who did their fair share of leg breaking and deal making to make things happen. And a few who went against that mold. You remember Roscoe Conkling, the gentleman with the amazing name who we mentioned earlier, who had a bid for president himself? Well, he might have been a tiny bit salty about Hayes. So he was very conspicuous. He didn't exactly go against the party line, but he made himself clearly not with the party line on it. He definitely did some negotiating with Southern folks, but he didn't do any hard and against the party line moves, basically. He just made his absence of support extra felt during this time. He was always pretty salty about it, and he didn't like Hayes, okay? They didn't get along. They had different platforms. So there's a problem. Big problem. 20 votes. Who do they go to? They're from South Carolina, and also Louisiana, and a little bit of Florida, mostly South Carolina and Louisiana. What the fuck, people? Get it together. Isn't it weird that the two states that have a massive fraud issue with the votes are the two states that still have militaries in them, military forces in them, to make sure the vote goes just as planned? Now, it's a good thing these militaries are there, ultimately, and when they're gone, bad things start to happen, which we will get into later. Now, there are attempts from both sides to ensure that these 20 electors end up ultimately, at the end of the day, on the side of Hayes. Okay, I don't know how I managed to do this, but a couple times in the video I seem to have referred to William T. Pelton as having bribed electors and various persons in the interest of supporting Rutherford Hayes. I meant the opposite. He was attempting to bribe people to support his uncle Tilden. I don't know what happened there. I appear to have crossed my wires at least twice. Just pretend they're not there. I don't want to go back and record them at this point. It's been a long time since I sat down and recorded this footage, and I don't want to do it again. You can't make me do it twice. There is Tilden's nephew who tries to bribe some folks into going over to Hayes. He does this during the election, I believe, not during the investigation of the electoral fraud. But there is bribery in his camp. And Hayes' old buddy, Thomas G. Blaine of Maine, he goes down to the South and he's like, hey boys, what up? Him and his crony, I'll insert his name here. But these two buddies, they go down and they convince a lot of people in the South that Rutherford might be a good idea. You know why? Because railroads. Because he will subsidize the railroads. Now, it's important to note that in both of these cases, neither candidate really had a lot to do with it. In fact, his faith in law and the American political system encouraged him to postpone decisions when confronted by demands that he rally public opinion. Ari Hoogenboom on Tilden. During the heat of the investigation, Tilden and Rutherford both kept their mouths shut. They preserved their sense of dignity of the office and did not say anything during the whole affair, even though there was a lot of pressure for them to act on it. Now, ultimately, the decision came down on the side of Hayes. Hayes got the election. He was 1 point above Tilden after these situations went over. There was a lot of dispute over the election in the weeks leading up to it, in the weeks after it. The New York Sun is my favorite source of bullshit on Rutherford Hayes. You guys should look it up. I know Trump will talk about how mean the media was to him. That's because he has never, ever read articles from the New York Sun about Rutherford B. Hayes. They obsessed. It was amazing, and they called him Rutherfraud. Just consistently, Rutherfraud. Amazing. The fraud consummated. Mr. Hayes is not president. Headlines of the New York Sun in March of '76. Tilden didn't have a good time. In the long run, his nephew became exposed for the corruption, and the Democrats, who had a bit of an edge due to certain decisions that Rutherford made, they did not have success in the next election because of this association with fraud. Realistically, fraud existed on both sides, especially on the micro level. But it's important to note that neither Tilden nor Rutherford were really party to it. It's also important to note that Tilden was a sore loser who complained about losing the presidency all the time. I would too. Petty man after my own heart, no doubt. Except that he's racist. And he looks a little weird. He looks like a really pretty old man. Like he looks like the guy who steals your grandma from grandpa. That's what he looks like. Trust me, it happens all the time. All over America, grannies are getting snatched by beautiful old men. Taken away to the South, to Dixie country, where suffrage is oppressed. Chapter 7, in which we discover whether or not civil service reform is the new norm.
The Senate is the citadel of the spoils system. Richard Henry Dana, Jr.
Which brings us into the important part of Hayes' career, the part that I think is his real legacy. And to understand this, I'm going to say the things that he did good and go over a list of things that he did bad, or bad things that happened during his presidency. Because he had a lot of flaws, and he definitely made mistakes that have negatively affected America to this very day. But he also made pushes for a movement that I think has benefited America all around as well. And I think it's worth it to remember him for his civil service reform as much as for the clumsy way that he ended Reconstruction. I think both of those are key. I think it's sad that all we really remember him for, or remember the period for really, is Reconstruction, when there was a whole nother side plot going on that's important in understanding the way our politics have evolved and the dangers politics face going into the future. Because patronage and civil service reform are timeless. You know, it could happen anywhere to any system of government. And now for a Hayes cabinet members lightning rounds to help you understand the way Hayes viewed politics and really wanted civil service reform to happen, and to bridge the gap between North and South, and also how that maybe might not have worked out the way he thought it would. John Sherman. Now, John Sherman was incredibly important. He really drove the reform that happened under Hayes' watch. The civil service reform, a lot of it had to do with customs houses and customs offices. And that's the Treasury Department, baby. That's John Sherman. William M. Evarts was a lawyer experienced in foreign affairs and was his cabinet head of State Department. Karl Schurz, my personal favorite. German immigrant. He'd fought in the German Revolution a little bit before this. He was a liberal Republican, so not hugely popular among the Republican mainstream. And he had butted heads with Grant in a previous election. And he was German. Not everybody liked Germans. In Tefousse, he treats him like he's an ethnic candidate, which is funny because he was German. He looks very German. He looks very, very German, like a German philosopher. I think he's beautiful. And he was the Department of the Interior. And he was hugely instrumental in reform. You look at the Bureau of Indian Affairs, you look at just everything, every aspect of reform had a little bit of a Schurz finger in its pie. But that's why he was picked up by Hayes, because of his reformer background. Hayes had wanted to make the Secretary of War Joseph E. Johnston, who was a Confederate general, and that was not a good idea. He was politically pressured into not doing that. Instead, he got George W. McCrae, Secretary of War. He got the War Department. And he helped originate the Electoral Commission Act and was a friend of the railroad lobbyists. So, yeah, that was his thing. Commissions were a thing that Hayes really liked to do. So I guess that makes sense. For Hayes's postmaster, you have Postmaster General, you have David M. Key, who was a Southern Democrat. So that wasn't very popular, but it did a lot to try and bridge the gap. Ultimately, he allowed Key to get away with a little too much patronage, which we'll explain in a bit. We've not explained patronage yet. We'll get there. But basically, he allowed Key to have a little corruption to try and win Southerners over to his cause. And that didn't work out for him. But David Key did a good job as postmaster, doing the actual postmaster stuff. Richard W. Thompson, Secretary of the Navy. He ended up leaving to try and work on the Panama Canal, which didn't work out for him. But we'll explain that when we get to foreign affairs, like right toward the end. For his Attorney General, Hayes picked Judge Charles Devens, and he was of the Massachusetts Supreme Court. There were a lot of people pretty happy with this, including a guy named George Hoare, who was his law partner at one point. And George Hoare is actually important in our Native American slice of this story. He has a certain tie to the Punkah situation. He had other folks who came into the office, but they aren't too important in our discussion here to understand Hayes and his character. So if you want to understand Hayes' politics, start with the cabinet. His cabinet was super duper heckin' Durkin Birkin freaking super controversial. Lots of people pissed off. There were one or two people in there who were there to gratify folks, but most of them were people he just thought would do the good job. Hayes believed in meritocracy, and it's worth noting that he believed that. He also wanted to see the best in people at a few key moments, and that came back to bite him in the butt as well as in the beard. It bit his beard after it bit his butt. It was terribly unhygienic. Anyway, on with the show. Before I talk about the individual events of the Hayes presidency, I think it's worth talking about the two major pushes that happened during Hayes' presidency that are kind of exclusive to it. One of them is civil service reform, and the other is the end of Reconstruction. His push for reform shows Hayes more admirable qualities, while his push for an end to Reconstruction in the South shows some of his less admirable ones. Obviously, Reconstruction did not end the way most of us would have liked, and we're facing consequences from it to this very day. But at the same time, the civil service reform he pushed for, that he served to be a valuable stepping stone in, is something we all benefit from today as well. So when we discuss these events, and when we discuss these issues, it's important to keep in mind that he wasn't just a slob who ended Reconstruction. Hayes believed strongly in education, and he believed strongly in people, I think, in a lot of ways. He was a very empathetic leader and a very empathetic person. And I think he really thought that the Southern governors, the Southern government would ultimately do the right thing and allow people of color to have equal suffrage. That was a pretty naive belief, I think, and not really what happened at all. But I really think he thought that would happen, based on his correspondence. He really seems to think that education in a little bit of time would heal the rift between the North and the South. Civil service, he was more realistic on, which can be confusing when you go from the one topic to the other, because he was very idealistic about how education would change people, and not as much about how quickly reform had to be done. Chapter 8, in which we actually get around to discussing civil service reforms. You see, the big problem with the civil service of the day could be summed up in one word, one system: patronage. Now, patronage is a political system whereby a politician appoints people in civil positions, postmasters, customs agents, lighthouse keepers, and consuls alike, to their positions. So essentially what was missing in the American system at the time was an unbiased way to get people into offices. Now, a person or a politician who upheld this system was referred to as a spoilsman. What's more, they would also have people in most positions do the actual campaigning, the legwork for them. They'd show up at conventions and caucuses to put in a good word for the cause. And this was common all around, but it was an especially bad problem in areas that had a more established political machine. Where you read the term machine, political machine, what that refers to is this sort of establishment where you have, say, a senator like Conkling, and they've got all of their underlings, people in politics and people in the civil service, and these people who are acting civil servants will go to the convention, and when ideas are discussed, they will raise their voice for your faction, for your opinion. What's more, they would also do actual campaigning in their home states or home regions. It was not uncommon for a week or two of leave to be given strategically for campaign season, so people could go out and campaign. And mind you, this was at a period in time before there was even a fight for people to have a lot of paid leave, to have weekends off, etc., etc. It wasn't a thing yet. And they were getting paid leaves. Paid leaves before paid leaves were a thing. I struggle to get paid leaves, and I live in 2019 to 20. 21, current year, I live in current year. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, whoa, Walter. Take 2 steps back before you were explaining patronage and explain to me what was up with these dues and gratuities. Because that's where patronage gets really sticky. You see, at the time, the way most politicians managed their campaign was not as issue-based. So they didn't travel the world, or the country, the world, that was their world, I suppose, but travel the country speaking, right, to the people, doing a lot of speeches. They did some, they didn't do it as much. Instead, they campaigned more through proxy. And the way they would do this is, A, they would gather money from the people they put into positions, right? They would take dues, donations for their campaign, if you would. This is pretty gross. This is pretty disgusting to me, but it was standard at the time, and it was standard pretty far back as far as I can tell. Not sure when it became like a deep-seated problem in the United States governing system, but it was that way for quite a while. I'll put it that way.
When Dr. Johnson defined patriotism as the last refuge of a scoundrel, he was unconscious of the then undeveloped capabilities and uses of the word reform. Senator Roscoe Conkling.
Roscoe Conkling of New York. Pretty corrupt. A huge amount of patriotism went on with him in office in New York as a senator. Now, we've mentioned Roscoe Conkling earlier in this video. He was one of those guys who ran against Hayes and was salty when he did not get the nomination. He was very conspicuously not supporting Hayes during a time when political-wise they needed more support to get him more securedly into the presidency. In fact, later on, he would call him Rutherford, which is a lot more clever than his fraudulency, which is what Tilden referred to him as throughout this period in time. The year is 1876. 70% of all imports into the United States going through New York. That's a pretty big deal. That's a lot of damage, as they would say. And it was a lot of damage. Because fortune of misfortunes, New York's custom house was bad to the bone. And this problem was becoming more evident with time. Now, all customs houses had similar issues to all the others. But New York was the worst. It was the most well established, it was the most open, it was the most disgustingly corrupt in its openness. It was also the biggest, juiciest, most obvious target to go after. So Hayes and the Department of Treasury head, Sherman, were like, let's do this. Let's get together and make it happen. So Sherman put together a commission called the Jay Commission. Do I have his name? John Jay. I wrote down his name this time. John Jay. John Jay's commission to New York to check out the customs house. Their goal was simple. The customs house. What is it? What does it do? Is it efficient? Does it have too many people in it? Are they taking gratuities? Are they in need of some changes to maybe make them less super duper bad? The answer was yes. Now ultimately, I think the biggest, most obvious thing that was happening at the time was they were undercutting the market. They were buying goods at a better deal. They were evaluating the goods that were coming in so that less tax was put on them before they were sold. And the other ports weren't doing that. So Chicago was one of those ports. Ports on the West Coast, of course, weren't doing that, to the same degree anyway. They didn't get caught, I'll put it that way. But New York was a heinous offender of this. Also, they were estimated to have like 20% more staff than they needed. Truly outrageous amount of people. And they're all getting paid, right? And they're all taking bribes. Bribes happened. Their bribes were a huge issue in New York. Just the customs office was always taking gratuities. And it's not entirely their fault, because the patronage system was built around that type of bribery and corruption. Now, before we continue on, I am going to define patronism for you, explain it, essentially. So, to say it as simply, as ridiculously simply as you possibly could, patronism in 1876 is the politicians put people into civil service offices. So the politicians are the people who decided who worked in the post office, the customs office, lighthouse keepers, consuls, to cabinets, the whole situation. If they weren't a politician who was an elected official, they got put into there through their political buddies, who were giving them a bone, throwing them a good old bone. Hayes experienced a little bit of this, honestly. His solicitor career doesn't ring of this as much as some people's careers would have at the time, but he definitely benefited through people he knew. Like, he was definitely lifted into his positions by his ties and contacts. And now it's time to break it down. So, in light of the issues seen in New York, which is going to be the template for everywhere, you got to remember, at the same time as New York, they sent commissions to many of the major port cities. San Francisco, Chicago, Boston. I think they sent one to Philadelphia too, though that's not a port city. All they have is like the Bell, and Benjamin Franklin was there for a while, and they use a pretty important city, I guess. But yeah, let's not talk about it. I'm just customs office of Philadelphia. Why you send a commission there? But they sent commissions to other places as well, is my point. The issue was sort of being addressed countrywide. The first order that Hayes put out regarding a positive change was basically one that said, get politics out of the civil service. They don't have to pay you dues, and they can't hold a political office while they are holding a civil office. Now, this caused some issues for a number of reasons. There were a couple of troubled children in the area that were a part of the same political machine, though some of them a little less than others. Which brings us to the anomalous and all-important cases of Chester Alan Arthur, Alonzo Cornell, and W.A. Simmons. Now, Arthur and Simmons are collectors. They were collectors for the Port of New York for Arthur, and the Customs Office in Boston for Simmons. And Cornell was the naval officer, which was a position at the time. It involved customs and naval law rather than being in the Navy in a general sense. But he was the naval officer for New York, the big apple, the big tasty red fruit. And what a big tasty red fruit this situation would become for them. Well, ultimately these three would be removed by Hayes' administration. Arthur and Cornell would really build their career out of it. Cornell became governor of New York before Hayes was even out of office on this sort of a ticket. He made some good political ties, I guess. And Chester Alan Arthur, he occupied a lesser known office called the President of the United States of America. And he's another character for another day. Probably another one of those lesser respected. Why is it so tight? It's the tightness of the office. Reading about presidents, it makes your clothes just shrink. It's amazing. Where was I? Oh yeah, that's right. They had to get Arthur and Cornell out. It took like a year. It took them a while to get them out of there. And when they did, the candidates they put forward were okay, but they didn't impress reformers. And for their replacements, for Boston, you have Franklin D. Roosevelt, Sr. Ha! Gotcha, you thought I was going to put another president in there. You have, for Naval Officer of New York, L.B. Prince. His middle name is Bramford or Branford. I don't know if it's an M or an N off the top of my head. I don't want to say it wrong. And for the Collector of New York, you have a fellow by the name of Merritt, Edwin Merritt. Pretty neat guy. He did a little bit of patronage, but he at least tried to do what Hayes kinda wanted. And by that I mean he did a test, and when the guy he got didn't work out, he switched back over to being patronage. Because apparently one guy who can actually do the job, even though he passed the test, was enough for everything to go haywire. Actually, to be precise and correct here, it was L. Bradford Prince, and he never got nominated for any of these positions. He ended up becoming a justice over in New Mexico and some other cool stuff like that instead. But Merritt was originally a surveyor, and then he became a collector when he was finally approved. And the naval officer was actually Silas Burt. And he's not Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt did whatever Theodore Roosevelt Sr. did. Who knows? It's a mystery. No one remembers. Nobody remembers any of the Roosevelts, right? Needless to say, the positive changes in New York as time went on, as they actually started applying what they were being told. I mean, it took them a while. I mean, there's one from John Jay that's like, oh, the partialness, the knavery. It's great. I'll put the quote up. It might not be from Jay, but it's a great quote on how they originally tried to make the changes before they got Arthur out. There was a whole fight over it. It was great. Outrageous partiality and knavery. It was, and everybody here knows it. A most impudent avenging of Conkling and his crew by ousting the men who had become distasteful. William Grosvenor of the Jay Commission. All this time, the opinion on civil service reform is improving in the public. People are starting to think that Hayes might actually be able to do it, though many sort of see that maybe not, because he wasn't perfect. Hayes had a lot of success in New York. His administration had a lot of success. But this didn't come without its ups and downs. Conkling and his allies also did well during this period of time, mostly taking advantage of Hayes' actions and his moderation and the fact that his administration wasn't exactly perfect, especially when it came to patronage versus civil reform. At the Republican Convention of New York on September 26 of 77, he and his allies retaliated.
Had all the gall and bitterness of Tophet been breathed into Conkling, he could not have shown more than he did toward Curtis and Hayes. W. L. Sessions. It was the saddest sight I ever knew. That man glaring at me in a fury of hate, storming his foolish blackguardism. George William Curtis.
As an aside note, when talking about Arthur and Cornell, they were written many letters from the Hayes administration. They were even offered consulships, or Arthur was at least. this was a bad look. And the more it came out over time, eventually it came out. They didn't come out with it right away. Conkling brought it out later when it benefited him to do it. But just really a bad look for Hayes. And it really allowed Cornell and Arthur to have future careers, and for better or for worse, is yet to be discovered. I haven't made my video on Chester Alan Arthur yet. We'll find out when we get to that. Spring of 1878. An important new order comes out from Hayes saying, okay guys, you are allowed to contribute to candidates that you like. Because he hadn't clarified that before with his order. Then he came out and was like, you could still give to political causes, you just don't have to. It is now wrong for them to force you, which they were doing, just to be clear. This civil service push was a big deal. He didn't have a lot of benefits behind doing it. The patronage system was pretty popular. It really effectively kept people's political careers going. Like I said, it wasn't really a time built around issue-driven politics and touring the entire nation. In fact, when you read about the electoral situation of '76 when he became President Hayes, he didn't tour. He didn't tour much. Him and Tilden let people campaign for them, because that was how politics was done, for better or for worse. And unfortunately, that system just keeps building upon the need for patronage, because the more infrastructure grows, the more civil servants you need, the more people there are, the harder it is to reach everybody, etc., etc. It's a dangerous game, and people weren't doing anything about it in large numbers. It was a problem that was affecting our country from the start. There was no protection against this. It was legal. And without that initial push, top down, we wouldn't have had the change. It had to happen eventually, and fortunately it happened in '76, '77, and '78, and a little bit in '79, and a little bit in '80. And it kept happening a little bit until we was good, or better. I mean, look at politics. It ain't all good. It's like, at most, 60% good. Speaking of 60% good, our next topic is going to be the one that's going to make you want to stab Hayes in his stupid bearded face. That's right, I'm talking about the end of Reconstruction. The South, '76. It's going through Reconstruction, but there's only a couple of states that still have Reconstruction governments. And a little bit down the line, when elections happen, it will kind of have two governments. But that's another story for another time, because you're talking about Louisiana and South Carolina. Or at least one of those states has a serious fraud problem, and the other has a really serious fraud problem. I mean, I think South Carolina got an extra % of people than it had voting. If you know anything about voting, it's impossible to get 100%. And it's even harder to get even close to 100%. Yeah, Walter, because that makes total sense. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you, dear viewers, why that is absolutely the most broken sentence I have ever said. I wasn't going to include it, but then I figured, no, this beautiful moment needs to be preserved for posterity. Like a real small amount of people actually vote. And you're talking about before it was like easy to drive. Then again, it was before they were making it impossible to vote. But it's a discussion for a different day. So it's '76. The inauguration is happening. It's March 5th. And Hayes is up there and he's like, man, we got to make changes in the South. And we got to make sure people of color are taken care of. The freedmen got to be taken care of. The best way to do it, he thinks, is education, and by removing bayonet rule from the South. Now, he's not entirely wrong. Having the military present in the South to ensure people are able to vote was effective, but not universally effective. The military of the United States wasn't very large, and most of it was tied up in the West, oppressing an entirely different demographic of people. If you can call racists people in the case of the South, then, like, yeah, it's technically both oppression. But they weren't being extremely effective. In fact, when push came to shove, the people of the South, or the white people of the South, made it clear that they were not going to toe the line until they were catered to. They were not going to allow the government to be reestablished fully until they were given just the full power to do that. Full faith, essentially, is what they wanted. And the thing about Rutherford Hayes, when you read about him, he does have faith in people. He put his faith in Hampton of South Carolina and Nichols of Louisiana to continue to support the rights of freedmen and Republicans and protect them during voting season. And as a result of this sort of show of faith, we have issues with ethnic relations, for lack of a better way to say it, to this very day. And to this very day, there's a political divide between North and South, a cultural divide between North and South in the United States. And that's pretty sad. I understand giving people the chance to do what's right. But as people often said about his civil service reforms, you've targeted a system, but you haven't really put much of a system in its place. He really didn't do anything to assure that freedmen would still be able to vote. Chapter 9, and the end of Reconstruction era. In the case of Marshall, Texas, during voting season, one year they were literally taken over by a mob during Hayes' administration. Like a Democrat mob of the minority of citizens of the town took over the town and put their own officers in. I mean, he pushed for them not to be recognized properly, but originally they were by the state of Texas. And it's just crazy. But my point is, the two strongholds are Louisiana and South Carolina, the last Republican governments. One of them has a Republican governor who is black. That's a big deal. It takes a long time for us to get back to having black people in office. I think it's April 10th in the case of South Carolina when the troops are removed, and not long after that, Hampton replaces the guy who's currently in there. Anyway, it's March. They're going into April, and they're pushing for change. On April 10th of that year, 76, Hampton moves in, and Chamberlain, the former governor, moves out. It was rather smooth compared to what would happen in Louisiana, but it still was pretty sad. Chamberlain, when he returned to Washington, had no thoroughfare, no celebration. But when Hampton arrived, he got a celebration. There were fireworks and a parade. Similar situation in Louisiana, only Louisiana wasn't going to go down nearly as hard. Louisiana got its own commission. Actually, my dude, I'm pretty sure both states were visited by a commission. It's just in my primary sources, they don't spend a lot of time focusing on the commission sent to South Carolina, but they do spend a good bit of time talking about the one in Louisiana. There's a lot more information there, I guess, but still. Sorry to mislead there. The commission in Louisiana was designed to determine whether or not Louisiana would protect the rights of all of its citizens or just white Democrats. They certainly did something while they were there. I know Packard, the governor, wanted them to actually resolve his issue, which was the dispute over whether he was governor or Nichols. It's because there was a dispute in both South Carolina and Louisiana. If I hadn't explained that well enough, I apologize. But he wanted that solved. And Hayes was clear to his commission that they were not trying to fix that problem. They were not. That was not their big struggle. Instead, he wanted them to basically figure out what Louisiana would do if they cut loose, basically, if they allowed Nichols to become governor and let them self-determine properly, without bayonet rule, as they called it. And I guess they did something. They were there, and then they said, go ahead, and then they left. March 20th, they removed the troops. And March 24th, Nichols moved in and pressed Packard out. Packard resisted all up until when they actually moved into the office. When they moved in, he gave up. He was still suffering from a bullet wound from an assassin who had tried to kill him. And he just didn't have the strength for it. But he really didn't want to lose his governorship that way. It's a little sad that he did. I guess the change had to be made, but I can't say that things got better in Louisiana and South Carolina after this. There's not a lot for me to say about Reconstruction and how badly it went. Rifle clubs, the White League, I'd say the KKK, but that's not fair to attribute that to the end of Reconstruction. The KKK was built during Reconstruction to terrorize Republicans and freedmen in the South. I wish I had more exuberance to put into it. It's a dumb situation. Hayes put forth his faith, and ultimately it was put in the wrong place. And this would become relevant later, when Congress got back together again to fix its problems. It's rider time in Congress. And Congress is Democrat at this point in time. They had a big wave after the last Republican situation with President Grant left it hard for Congress to become filled with Republicans again. The good news is Hayes had the veto hammer, and man did he veto. He vetoed lots and lots of bills, trying to make sure that election laws were protected. So the last time Congress had gotten together was March 3rd of '76, trying to desperately fix the electoral mess that somebody left lying all over the floor. But in their busyness to finish that, they didn't address another issue. The military needed paid, and they didn't do that. So they went without pay, which is a pretty big issue. So eventually they had to call a special coming together, a special meeting of the 45th Congress. Hayes called it, but he waited till October 15th because he wanted everyone to cool down about civil service and about the Southern question. He thought everybody'd be over it by then, but they weren't. In fact, it's here where you start seeing writers start appearing on bills. Bills usually involving very necessary funding. Hayes shot down every writer-including bill that he reasonably could. I think he got all the writer-including bills that had anything to do with election laws, which is what was mainly targeted by Southern politicians, including Hampton and Nichols. You see, Hampton and Nichols did not keep their word. They continued to do their best to hamper the 14th and 15th Amendments. They honored it on paper, but they kept making laws that made it difficult for them to actually be effective. So people of color were not voting because they were being blocked from the polls by terrorists and assholes. So some of the things Southern Democrats tried to do, I won't go this in any particular order. You can look it up. This is stuff they actually did, paraphrased extremely with these laws. They tried to make laws making it illegal to pay U.S. Marshals for their presence at electoral polls. They made laws against allowing troops to be called in for similar reasons. Hayes really wanted to push for an allowance for troops to be brought in to restore order. There are a couple of reasons for that. They had the riots of '78 happen too, which was a little down the line in this video. We will discuss that. And just generally, they did their best to make sure that protections for voters were not allowed to be given funding. But they ultimately were, right? No bill ever got through that said, oh, marshals can't protect the polls. But the black code still happened, right? And that's the real tragedy here, is that the system was removed, but nothing was put in its place. And I think this is Hayes' greatest failing. Chapter 9, in which to be a native is a crime. Alright, so it's time for a rewind. We've discussed President Hayes and civil service. We've discussed President Hayes and Reconstruction and its sad, tragic death by a million stabbings in a back alley behind the voting poll where it just couldn't make it because an entirely legitimate rifle club ambushed them outside of the polls and just wouldn't let them vote. And also wouldn't be prosecuted when they murdered them, so they did. Too real? It is too real. But let's go back to a simpler time. A time when the military was still in the South, keeping hate from blooming in a public and accepted way. And instead, Americans had to turn their hate to the native inhabitants of this country. The time of the Grant administration. So the Grant administration had this thing, the Department of the Interior. And within the Department of the Interior was the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs was not great. The Bureau of Indian Affairs had a huge problem with fraud at the time. It had a ring of fraud, a fiery, fraudulent ring of death encircled the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Indian agents, Indian Bureau agents, I think it's too many words to add in front of agent, but these agents, they would get into bed with corrupt contractors and make vile money-grubbing deals which would allow the contractors to defraud both the government and the Native Americans, and they get kickbacks from that and whatnot, and whatever their deal was. Maybe sometimes they were just like friends and family, but you know how it is. Corruption's corruption, no matter how shallow, no matter how deep. But it was pretty notable because it was recognized at the time as a corruption problem. And there was some serious discussion about moving the Bureau of Indian Affairs from the Department of the Interior to the Department of War. Now, this might seem to you like it might not be the best idea anyone ever had, and that's true, and that's how many people felt about it at the time. It's probably the main drive behind why it didn't get moved, is because there was a thought that if you handed it over to the War Department, things would swing in a more genocidal direction than they were already kind of swung. And people didn't want that, for the most part. In like 2/3 of the country, they didn't want a straight out genocide. Population-wise, land-wise, it's probably 2/3 wanted it the other way. You know how it is. You know, it's just land, population. What does it matter? We don't need a representative system. We could just represent it by regions. Every region should have the same right, even if they only have a population of like 25. I'm looking at you, Montana. Coming back down to earth from Miley Cyrus' own country. Let us discuss issues that happened with Native American policy at this time. Before we get to the juicy stuff, the fighting, before we talk about the fighting that I want you all to know, I want you to understand how Hayes changed the approach to politics and Native Americans. It's important to note that Hayes' approach and Schur's approach and Sheridan, who was the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. Actually, Philip Henry Sheridan was a prominent commander at this time in the military. He was not the commissioner of the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I don't know who was, and I'm too lazy to find out. So just know that my context for Sheridan when I originally filmed this was off. He's actually a commander. He still has a lot of prominence in decision making, as you shall see. They did not view it in an enlightened or good or not extremely racist way. You gotta understand that they didn't view it as like an ethnic thing, but they viewed the culture of the Native Americans as inferior and wanted it to go away. And admittedly, Hayes wanted it to go away through education, which is a lot less granty of him than, say, the policy of just murder them until their culture is gone. But it's still a pretty shitty approach, and definitely got grisly here and there. But he did make things better. He busted the ring of corruption. He reformed the way they did things in a lot of ways, good and bad. He did something rather unconstitutional in that he allowed religious groups to be involved. Basically, he allowed religious figures and religious organizations to take place of some of the management of affairs, so to speak. Specifically, to my understanding, the people he put into positions of authority were some of the 8 unpaid commissioners who served under the department head of the Commission of Indian Affairs. So basically they had a team of commissioners who did all the legwork. They were unpaid, which was why one of the easiest groups of people to get into the position was men of the cloth and missionaries. It's hard to say whether or not him putting religious figures into positions of power like that kept things the way they were viewpoint-wise in the United States. But it's hard to say that it was definitely the best way to do it. It did discriminate against Catholics. Hayes had this issue his entire career. Just as a side note, he constantly did stuff that discriminated against Catholics. And it's hard to say how much of it was an actual dislike of Catholicism and just policies that happened to swing that way, or if it was some measure of populism. He also, to his credit, created a police for Indian reservations, right? So reservations that had Native Americans on them could now have officers of the law that belonged to that reservation. That was one of his projects that went through that makes a pretty big deal versus having justice and not having any enforcement of your law whatsoever. I know which I would choose. At the end of the day, I'd say that Hayes and Schurz and Sheridan actually made a positive difference despite their hang-ups. I think their desire to do what's right is still evident here, even though they had some pretty shitty viewpoints. They were viewpoints that were products of the time. As much as I hate using that turn of phrase, and it's not a good excuse, it is true. That is why they believed what they believed. It's because that's what most people did believe at the time. Or worse. Anyway, on to the fun shit. All that killing, all that. I'm throwing fireballs. I'm a wizard. All right. All right. The first big bad one, the Nez Perce, as they say it in English, the Nez Perce tribal group, also referred to in their language as Nimi-Poo, which is, I hope, the right way to say it. I feel bad if it's wrong. If any of you Nimi-Poos are out there and want to correct me, please call me up, send me a text or an email. I will fix it all. I will take it all back. Interesting group of people. Fascinating interactions. Long-standing history by the time you get to 1877 of getting along well with their white American neighbors. In fact, they sheltered Lewis and Clark while they were on an expedition. In the year 1863, several Nez Perce chiefs were coerced through bribery, trickery, threats, etc., into agreeing to a treaty that essentially moved them from the Wallaby Valley, which is where they were currently settled, to the Lapwai Reservation, which was not that far away. It was just over in Idaho. It's where they ended up ultimately. It's not where they ended up at first, though, which is the reason is gonna wow you. But for now, it's not gonna be a big deal, not for another 15 years, until the issue begins really rearing its ugly head. Now in 75, Grant promised Chief Joseph of the Nez Perce to uphold the original treaty. Basically, he wasn't going to make them move. He did not do anything. He just sort of allowed what was going to happen to happen. He was just talking. It was all talk. Grant did a lot of that. He wasn't very strong, and there were congressmen in the states that wanted the Wallaby Valley to themselves. Congress is too much for Grant to deal with. He's like, Congress, if only I just had to deal with the president's office and my cabinet, things would be fine. It's, that and my wife, it'd be okay. Just come into the office, be president, go home, visit his wife, not interact with any congressmen, not have your strings pulled in really obvious ways. This typical Grant wish fulfillment, wish thinking right there. The point is, in 75, they were given assurances that things would be all right. They weren't going to get shunted to a different part of the region. And it's worth noting that at least Lapwai was in the same climate zone. It was not a different climate entirely. That's going to be important in just a minute when you find out what actually happens to the Nez Perce after all the brouhaha occurs. By January 6th of 77, the 63 treaty, the 1863 treaty, it was the treaty that was going to go down. It was the treaty that was going to be respected and upheld by our government, and so their government had to respect it too. It's not an ideal situation, but what you gonna do? The Nez Perce basically agreed to go along peacefully, even the non-treaty ones. Now the non-treaty leaders were White Bird, Looking Glass, and Chief Joseph. Chief Joseph is sort of the main antagonist because he got the most attention and did a lot of the important leading. But Whitebird and Lookingglass are pretty important too in the course of the Nez Perce War. On May 14th of 1877, General Oliver Otis Howard parlayed with the non-treaty Nez Perce to make an agreement to come to a peaceful negotiation. He didn't do that. He just told them what they had to do in 30 days, or else military come in, do a big bad, and do a murder. But at least he gave them 30 days to gather their massive herd of cattle and harvest their crops and gathered their women and children and put them on carts, and I guess that's how they moved their women and children. That's how we move women and children in this country, right? We put them on carts. You'd see it all the time, driving down the highway. You just see people's wives and kids in the trailer. They put the dogs in the bed of the truck where it's safe, and the horses, they go up in the cabin of the truck with the driver. That's how it goes. I really got my wife with that one. That's great. I'm killing it. I'm killing it, people. Long story short, the Nez Perce who remained in the valley agreed. Not everybody wanted this, but they agreed. Now, there was a certain young brave among the Nez Perce, I believe among Whitebird's camp, who wanted to avenge the death of his father. So he got a small group together and he sought out the person who had killed his father. He didn't find this person, but he found some people who were of an equally ill repute, but also white, and murdered them. This was not looked upon in a positive light, but there were 18 people from Lookingglass's and Chief Joseph's and Whitebird's camp that were like, let's do it again. So they went and they killed more people. Notably, they targeted people who had abused them in the past. It was like a vigilante thing, not a let's murder random folks thing, like you might think by the way I just said that. Let me be clear, I am like at least 50% behind these murders. The other 50% is like, oh, come on, man. Because it was a really bad time to kill folks. I mean, you're talking a couple days before moving day, and also the army is right there. And yeah, you can guess what happened next. That's right, there was a war. Howard chose to blame the murders on the leadership. He blamed it on Joseph. Joseph was not in town. He had gone on a hunting trip, like to hunt one last time before he got moved to an entirely different region. So he was not to blame, but that was like the official story, was that it is Joseph's fault that these murders happened, not a bunch of angry youngins going out to kill people. So, June 17th of 1877. Captain David Perry and 99 cavalrymen and also 11 volunteers, which you're going to notice a pattern with in just a second, moved to apprehend the Nez Perce, particularly the perpetrators, but they basically moved against them aggressively. The Nez Perce sent out 6 old men to treat with David Perry, and then some volunteers shot at them, and one of them got murdered, and the natives shot back, and so it was wartime. As a side note, none of the old men actually got shot. The only person who got shot in this first brace of forays was actually on the U.S. Army side, though they did fire at the old men approaching under a white flag, just to clarify. And this is going down in a place called Whitebird Valley. Now, I don't know if it was named this before or after, but it's an apt name. The battle did not go well for the U.S. Army. Chief Joseph and his command managed to divide David Perry's command up into like separate sections. They lost, what's the number? Casualties. They lost 34 men and they lost like 63 rifles, which was a bigger deal because the Nez Perce didn't have a lot of rifles. They had like the ammunition that they needed for a little bit of war, and they had bows and arrows, and they had a couple of rifles. But after this, they had like enough to arm themselves. 63 was enough for their small force. Basically, this started the war off for real. At this point, General Howard sent a group to secure the Nez Perce, which were not with Chief Joseph. Captain Stephen C. Whipple. It's always a Steve, am I right, ladies? He comes up, he's got 2 Gatling guns, he's got a bunch of cavalry, he's got 20 volunteers because he just decided he needed 20 more guys with guns and no training to accompany him. And he goes there and he does something genius. He's like, let's find the chief, let's find Looking Glass and talk to him. Next level intellect shit. But you know what? Those 20 volunteers, they're ahead of the curve. And one of them's like, you know what? Let's just start shooting people. And they do it. They start shooting people. And you know what happens? Everybody runs away, which is probably good. They would have probably died. They didn't have their Gatling guns set up. They were just like a bunch of dudes there in the middle of a bunch of well-armed, slightly prepared Native Americans who had probably heard of Joseph by now, mostly. We know Looking Glass had. He had no intention of joining the war at this point because he looked at that and thought, that's not a good idea. But, you know, now he had no choice. You know, they shoot some people, they run away, and good old Stephen Whipple, he's like, oh man, what did Papa Whipple always say? When the Whipples get whipped, burn and steal everything. So that's what he did. He burnt the teepees, he stole the crops, he stole the horses. He stole like a lot of horses. He stole hundreds of horses that day. It was an impressive amount of horses for like 2 detachments of cavalry to take and 20 dudes who are unable to control their trigger fingers. I'm surprised they didn't shoot all the horses. But that didn't end well either, because now Looking Glass joined Joseph in the fighting. Now, after Whitebird, Joseph did a smart thing, and when Howard brought his main force up after him, he was like, there's a river, and I'm going to put that between me and you. And believe it or not, this genius moment of putting a basic geographic barrier between you and your enemy made him the Napoleon of the Indians. That's what the media, the lamestream media called him. Apparently, this made him a military genius. Now, he wasn't, but he was not bad. He understood his own home turf well enough. Chief Joseph and Whitebird actually were not the war chiefs of the Nez Perce. They made a few strategic decisions, but not a lot of tactical war-based decisions during the Nez Perce War. They did more of the guiding, the leading, and the managing of the camps, etc., etc. Chief Joseph was just the name that the United States, the white world, knew from the Nez Perce. So he's the name that people associated with all these victories and battles, etc., etc. So, Chief Joseph and the gang are on the other side of this river. And they decide they're going to head north, and Montana lies to the west. And they're either going to join up with the Crows in Montana or join up with Sitting Bull in Canada. Either way, it's better than just hanging out and being dead when the army eventually beats you. So they sort of started moving that way. Now, they had a few clashes with Howard, and Howard would have lost his job, but he had one victory, which he proceeded by just allowing them to escape after he beat them in a fight. which was another genius military Howard decision that he made at this period in time. Truly the best military thinker of our generation, our 1870s generation.
I am tired of fighting. Our chiefs are killed. It is cold, and we have no blankets. The little children are freezing to death. Hear me, my chiefs. I am tired. My heart is sick and sad. From where the sun now stands, I will fight no more forever. Chief Joseph.
The Nez Perce were eventually cornered by Nelson A. Miles, Brigadier General working with General Howard. It's probably a good thing it wasn't Howard. Howard would probably just let him get away again. Anyway, they'd been through a lot of civilian loss just to the hard traveling. They'd crossed the Continental Divide 2 times, a lot of rivers, a lot of mountains. While they were in Montana, the governor of Montana freaked out, and he sent a telegraph to Hayes asking for permission to raise 500 volunteers to try and go help. But at that point in time, the Hayes administration was like, volunteers again? I think that's a bad idea. And so it didn't happen. Nelson Miles would go on to be an activist for the Nez Perce throughout his life. He was always vocal about trying to get them moved to a more appropriate location. After the war, they were sent to Oklahoma, to Indian Territory. So basically, what is now that Midwestern empty bunch of states used to be a sort of a geographical bucket where it was like, oh, we don't want these Native Americans here anymore. Let's just yeet them into this land that we haven't figured out how to farm properly yet. And so they did this with the Nez Perce. And Miles had kind of promised them that they would end up in the Lapwai Reservation. So it was a bit of a sticky situation that they had themselves in. But Nelson was active throughout his life trying to make waves. He literally approached President Hayes' administration about it to try and get something done. But Hayes ultimately kind of ignored him. We don't know why. He just went there, tried to get a meeting with Hayes. Hayes never got into a meeting with him. Nothing happened on that front. But it was a pretty great tragedy. The Nez Perce went through a lot of years of not having children survive on the new reservation that they were sent to. And things were just pretty glum. But things get better. In 1884, the Nez Perce were allowed to go to the Lapwai Reservation. And Joseph was even allowed to visit his home in 99 and also in 1900. But he never managed to purchase a plot of land there. No one ever sold to him. And ultimately, they ended up doing okay in the Lapwai. If you look it up on the map, there's a lot of geography that has an identity surrounding the Nez Perce Reservation. Like further south in Idaho, there's the town of Joseph, which I'm assuming is named after the Joseph. I mean, he was kind of a big deal. Unfortunately, unlike other more newsworthy chiefs of the day, Joseph never really got his day in the sun. He never got to travel to Washington to make his case. Miles had to try and do it for him. And he never got his full recognition for how much work he did to keep his people safe. Like, he wasn't the great military leader of the whole conflict. If anything, his contemporaries, his contemporary chiefs with a greater amount of experience did more of the commanding. But he did a lot to bring those people together, and he did a lot to keep the people safe, his actual tribes, from starving or running out of food or taking the wrong road through the mountainous regions of Idaho and Montana. A couple of cases are like the meh case scenario. Like, they're not a good scenario, but they could have ended a lot worse, especially from a top brass handling the situation level. And those two situations would be the Ute uprising and the Ponkas situation. It's worth noting, now that we've talked about the Nez Perce, that Hayes and the administration did learn by 79, when the Ute utility uprising, hold on, I gotta figure out what their name is. Now that we've talked about the Nez Perce War, it's worth mentioning that Hayes did improve his policy regarding Native peoples by not moving people around by the term ended. It is little too late, if you ask me, but it is worth noting. For example, in 79, when the Ute uprising occurred, instead of putting down the Utes and moving them out to Indian country, Indian territory from western Colorado, where they were currently living, they still took some of their lands, let's be fully honest. But they did leave land for them in the region that they actually lived, and they compensated them for land that they had lost, or lost access to, I should say. And you got to remember, there was like a massacre involved in this. There was murders of Indian borough officials, but Schurz was smart on this one. He kept the army and the state from going in and doing a fight when a fight wasn't needed. And yeah, so that's a good one. A slightly less good one is the situation with the Ponkas.
A great and grievous wrong has been done to the Ponkas. President Hayes.
The Ponkas, they were a people group that had kind of been unjustly removed from where they were going to be. So Hayes is just chilling. When he gets a ring on his phone, like ring ring, it's Senator George Hoarman the Boar Man, and he tells Hayes about the Ponkas. And also, he probably wrote him a letter. He probably didn't call him on his telephone, which he had, by the way. 10 out of 10, pro dude. So, 1868, U.S. Sioux Treaty gave Sioux like 96,000 acres of the Ponkas Reserve along the Mississippi River. Now, the Ponkas and Sioux were traditional enemies, so they did some murder to each other, I guess. They didn't get along too well because they had been enemies for like forever. Who knew that putting them in the same place would not work out? Certainly not me. Certainly not I. I was not keen to that until I read about it just the other week. So the Ponkas, they ask, oh man, could you guys move us to the Omaha Reservation in Nebraska? So long story short, in 1876, they get moved to a state so like Nebraska that it is basically the same state. They get moved to Oklahoma. You see what I did there? But they get moved. And they begin their journey. They're in South Dakota. That's where they started. Just to give you an idea of how rough this journey is. And how different the climate is. They get to the Quapaw Reservation. They don't like it. But in 78, they find a new spot. They find land on the Salt Fork of the Arkansas, or at the Salt Fork, of the Arkansas. I said that wrong. I apologize. It's at the Salt Fork, not on it. There's not like a fork made out of salt that they built their homes on. No, it's at the Salt Fork where you make the salt. You know, it's just a good time, if I remember that correctly, unless it's for something else. Maybe that's just where they apply salt to their meals. You have to go out there. The entire state has to travel to the salt. Okay, no, we're not going to pursue this bit. They liked the land, but there was a desire to return home among them. Schurz was not keen on this at all, because, you know, they just moved them to make them safe. But, you know, as time went on, that began to change. In 79, Standing Bear, a lesser-known fellow of the Native American cultures of the Northern Americas, he went on a quest with a few other members of his tribe to carry his grandchild, his dead grandchild, back to his homeland to, you know, properly dispose of his body, properly honor him with funerary customs. I don't know if they would bury him or not. I don't think so. They don't succeed in this. They kind of get stopped and sent back, which is pretty sad, pretty unfortunate for him, and really just shows the injustice of the situation. You know, when you have to choose between honoring your sacred beliefs and keeping your family safe, and then your family dies and you need to honor them properly, or, you know, what's the purpose, I guess, of defending them if in the end you have to dishonor them? I don't know. It's quite a conundrum. Standing Bear gets stopped. He and his party get detained. Now here's where things get interesting, because they are unlawfully detained. There's no justification for their detainment. They're not given one. They're not treated lawfully. So a fellow by the name of Tibbles, who's probably the subject for a future video, he's a sort of a preacher activist who married into one of the tribes. I forget which one. My apologies. But I'll have it up on the video. Good character. He'll probably be his own character study of a future video. Hopefully it'll take me less than 1 billion years to make that one. But he gathered some lawyers and he got some representation for them to try and help them. And that actually worked to get them back to their reservation. In 1880, this is some late Hayes craziness, Tibbles actually tried to gather a whole bunch of the Ponkus and take them home, just in a giant caravan. That didn't work out well. He was very much arrested for that. In 81, they did allow the Ponkus who wished to return to their ancestral lands. 150 of them did. The rest, like 550 of them, remained.
The Ponkus are entitled to more than the ordinary care at the hands of the government. Carl Schurz. In short, nothing should be left undone to show the Indians that the government of the United States regards their rights as equally sacred with those of its citizens. President Hayes. His great gratification in the Ponca message just read to the Senate. Every word of it meets my hearty commendation, and it is worthy of your high office and high character. In my opinion, it will pass into history as a great state paper, marking an epoch in our dealings with the weak and defenseless, more conspicuous and than any other public expression from the head of the nation for many years. Senator Henry L. Dawes.
Chapter 10, in which stuff gets smashed and burned, and communism takes the blame.
The working people everywhere are with us. They know what it is to bring up a family on 90 cents a day, to live on beans and cornmeal week in and week out, to run in debt at the stores until you cannot get trusted any longer, to see the wife breaking down under the privation and distress, and the children growing sharp and fierce like wolves day after day because they don't get enough to eat. A striker in Baltimore.
So the Great Strike of 1877, was quite the spectacle, you might say. Today we have stuff like the Boston riots, and, well, we have some nasty enough riots and protests like Charlottesville and the Boston situation. And it's worth noting that I say that with all the love in the world for anarchy and protests and getting mad and demanding change. These situations had nothing on the Great Strike of 1877. The Great Strike is sort of as a result of a financial disaster called the Great Panic of '83, and the cumulative downfall, depression, downgrade, erosion of the American economy and the railroad's ability to make money without absolutely screwing over its workers, for lack of a copacetic way to say that, a good way to say that. Just to make this make sense, it's 1873, and you start working at the railroad. 3 years later, in 76, your pay was down 20%. Chances were. Your average person lost about 20% of their pay. And then indebtedness, stock bond indebtedness was like 16% for the company. So they weren't doing well financially, the railroads. And this is the era of B&O, the Pennsylvania Railroad, the New York Erie Railroad, New York Central. Don't think Texas Pacific Railroad, because that never happened. It was going to happen, but it died because a bunch of people had a big strike, and all the people involved in the railroad had a black mark next to their name as far as government was concerned, and giving people land to build railroads so that strikes could happen on them. Okay, so here's a good number. So B&O stock, it was $191 in 1876. That's a lot of money. That's a good amount of money. That's good money. You know, that's for a stock. In 1877, it was $79. It was nothing. it just dropped hilariously. Pennsylvania Railroad went from 56 to 32. New York Central went from 117 to 90. It is not good. But what really kicked it off is systematically the railroads, and they worked together, whether they said they did or not. They did this in such rapid succession and with such grand coordination as to not mess with each other's dividends that it's impossible that they did not work together. They shaved 10% off of the paycheck of everyone making $1 or more. So this really this wrecked everybody's day. You're talking railway workers, brakemen, loaders, freight people, for lack of a better way to say that. You're talking conductors too, though conductors obviously don't have as difficult a job as brakemen or people who have to rapidly load trains. I think it was Pennsylvania that double screwed themselves by deciding to only run double headers. And those are two trains pulling an extra long locomotive. I said that backwards on purpose to get Marshall mad. Marshall, you heard that, right? You got a little stormy when you heard it. You got to admit it. You got a little pissed. You got a little angry. You got a little furrow in your brow when I said that. Basically, the point is, the man was really going to pound town on these railroad workers. And there had been other strikes in other places, right? Other departments of society. The coal mines, had strikes. There were others. I'm not thinking of them off the top of my head. Usually, if there was a strike, more than one party got involved in it at this point in time, because it turns out it was a big community deal to make sure like vast chunks of people could afford to feed children. You know, that's just how it is. And that's especially the case for the Great Strike. You're talking about people coming from all different backgrounds, all different hard work backgrounds to join the ruckus, basically. July 1877. Everyone's like, all right, 10%, that's not good. We can't abide that. And so people start shutting down work with strikes. Now, strikes are different from riots. Riots are crazy, out of control. Strike is like, we will not work. And occasionally that extends to, we will not allow anyone to continue the work that we were doing by being in the way. So, like, the brakemen and others would block the brake sections. There were a couple of times when people mobbed onto the railroad tracks. Basically, people refused to work, and they blocked people from working. So the first hubbub was on the 16th of July. That is in Baltimore, but that one didn't get very far. They were a little ready for it there, and they dispersed it quickly. But then Martinsville, West Virginia happened, and that's where things really kicked off with the Great Strike. That's where the fighting and the blocking and the ruckus really started. Chapter 10.5. So the railroad workers are mad. How bad could things possibly get?
It is a question of bread or blood, and we are going to resist. A defiant flagman in Pittsburgh.
The riots. They spread all over, mostly the Northeast and the Midwest. In Chicago, there was one really bad one that I think is worth mentioning, where the police and the militia broke up the riot before troops showed up. 18 people were killed, a bunch of them not rioters, of course. And they just attacked these people until they were dead and out of the way. Really nasty stuff. On July 31st of 1877, Tom Scott, in response to the Illinois riot, St. Louis, Illinois riot, sent a rather interesting and desperate attempt to get help from Hayes. Stamp out the mob, now rampant. A manager in St. Louis. Hayes himself was not for these strikes, but he very, very much emphasized with the workers on strike. He did not like railroad interests. He did not like the whole Marxist wave, you might say, but he also realized that there wasn't much of a Marxist wave at the time. The press at the time freaked out about it. They really thought it was the Marxist wave, communism in its purest form. And really, there were only a few thousand Marxists in the country. And for what it's worth, in St. Louis, they did the only peaceful showing. They're the only people who came out in numbers and peacefully protested the whole time. When it comes to strikes, the Marxists, they're your people. They do a good strike. They do a good well-organized strike in the 1870s. Walter approved. Whoosh, put the seal of approval. Put Stalin's face up there. Put Marx up there. Put Karl Schurz. He looks like Marx. You don't have a picture of Marx ready. Just put him up there. One German philosopher is much the same as another. Another important note, the strike killed Tom Scott's aspirations of a Texas Pacific land grant, because all the big railroad people took a prestige hit. This was not a good look, that they took away people's money until they got so mad that they started violence. I wish that people still felt that way about strikers. I wish people could get mad and react and not just be treated like assholes all the time. So in case that first bit on like what the strike was misses, okay. So it's July 16th, and in Boston the first strike starts up, but it doesn't get very far. But then in Martinsville, West Virginia, the land of freedom and familial love, as they say. Also roads that are not as nice as Pennsylvania, shade thrown. is where the strike really got going. People were successfully shutting down the rail hubs, the rail zones, the rail hives. Their mother queens were abuzz with rage. It didn't stop there. You're talking Chicago, St. Louis, New York, Pennsylvania, all over the freaking place. Ohio! It took to the end of the month for things to settle down. By July 30-ish, they were pretty much done rioting. Some riots got really bad and destroyed a lot of things, like the one in Chicago. The Chicago one was pretty bad. There was a clash between basically the police and the militia of the region and rioters which was just attacks being launched on rioters until everything ended up the way they wanted, which was no more riot. Who cares if 18 people, some of them bystanders, were dead? And that was before troops could get there. But speaking of troops, the troops, United States Army, behaved really, really well during these strikes and riots. And I'm not even kidding. They did a good job at keeping the peace. In Philadelphia, the militia tried to break up the riots, but did a bad freaking job. There's at least one case, and I forget the name of the city it was in, I'll include it on the screen, where the militia did not want to attack the people striking because they knew them, and they just chatted and ended up like on the same side. It is great. It's great. It's beautiful. But most of the strikes didn't end up like that. Most of the strikes ended up in riots, like all of them, except for St. Louis. St. Louis, where the Marxists stepped in. Marxism. The true way, the true glorious way. Put Stalin up there. Put Putin up there. No, not Putin. He's not. Put Trotsky up there. Put Karl Marx up there. Put Karl Schurz up there. He looks like Karl Marx. Play the music. Play the Soviet music. Soviet theme. Yeah, that's the stuff. Oh wow, what a movie. Anyway, back down to it. The troops, the American troops, they did a good job. They only protected private property and people who were working. They did not work to dispel strikers. They did not work for the railroad companies to make sure things kept running smoothly. They just protected and served. That was it. They did not kill anybody during this period of time that we know of, which was a huge point of pride for Hayes. He was really happy that the federal troops didn't kill anybody. And it's good, too, because there weren't a lot of them. They could not have gone into a conflict and done some real fighting without failing to a massive mob of people, many of whom were armed. Like, there were armed people. There were, like, situations of snipers and shooting affrays in some of these strikes and riots. So it does say something that every place that troops were deployed, they didn't have confrontation. It says something about American values at the time, and it says something about the troops' behavior. It's worth noting. It's a good thing. Anyway, to wrap up, the strikes really brought into the public eye all of this mess, all of this railroad capitalism, this filthy capitalism. Put him back up on the screen. Play the music again. Come on, let's add a few more. Let's add Dr. Zhivago. Let's add the Black Widow, Scarlett Johansson. Put Scarlett Johansson up there. She's a communist, right? She's from Russia. Hawkeye. They've hooked up a few times. They're surely a socialist by now. It brought a huge amount of attention to it, and I think it was needed. And while it took a long time for legislation to be put forth to take wind out of these particular capitalist pigs' sails made out of pigskin. They are their pigskin sails. They made it out of the scrawny bacon that was their workers. And they propelled themselves into big fat money piles. They washed ashore of the big fat money pile islands that they live upon. And it was on the backs of the workers. They rode worker seahorses from Atlantis of capitalism to the great capitalist islands. of major wealth. I don't know what I'm doing anymore. I need to stop. This has got to end.
The strikes have been put down by force, but for now, the real remedy. Can't something be done by education of the strikers, by judicious control of the capitalists, by wise general policy to end or diminish evil? The RR strikers, as a rule, are good men, sober, intelligent, and industrious. President Hayes.
Chapter 11. Faux règne affaires. Subsection A, in which that state we stole from Mexico hates on Chinese immigrants. Number one, there was an issue with there being a lot of, there wasn't an issue. It was an imagined issue. It was a bullshit issue. Everyone was like, look at all of these Chinese people, all these Chinese males. Oh, wow, they're like 33% of the population of San Francisco and stuff. That's not good. And so people were making a fool of themselves, including my boys in the Marxist Workingmen's Party of the United States. Apparently in the West they were racist all the time to people of Chinese descent. To their defense, the population of Chinese people was mostly male, which was very concerning to the local populace because it made it seem as though they had no intention of staying. And it's hard to say. I'm sure a lot of them did not intend to stay. But at the same time, they were working in this country and spending money on groceries in this country, etc., etc. But the population of the West, California type of region, not huge fans. Really wanted them driven out or murdered or whatever. Some of them wanted them murdered. It was a harsh time. Some of them did some murdering too. It was not good. There was a push to just cut immigration entirely. But the status of immigration from China was protected by a previous treaty. So Hayes did not want to violate that treaty. So early in his presidency, that's what he said. I don't want to do this. I don't want to violate the treaty. We'll negotiate a better deal. And a lot of people hailed him as being really just liberal-minded on it. And honestly, it wasn't really that. It was a desire to uphold a treaty with a foreign nation, not a desire to protect the interests of these folks. Though, also to his defense, Hayes did not believe that the issue was out of hand in the way he thought it was either. Because he thought, he looked at the numbers and saw that they were in decline, which they were. The population wasn't rapidly growing anymore. It was sort of starting to peter out. And, you know, view it the same. But at the same time, he did not have any desire to protect an ethnic minority in this situation, right? It wasn't his main motivation. And they did negotiate a new that made a quote-unquote better deal regarding immigration to and from. It was a little more controlled immigration. I go into details about it, but I don't know all the details about it. It's kind of not my forte. It's not really my wheelhouse. In this particular instance, it doesn't have a heavy effect on the topic of Hayes. I mean, it was his man, his boy over there, his consul over there. George Frederick Seward, doing most of the legwork anyway. We both know it. I know it, you know it, the consuls know it. This is what everybody knows.
I am satisfied the present Chinese labor invasion. It is not, in any proper sense, immigration. Women and children do not come. Is pernicious and should be discouraged. Our experience in dealing with the weaker races, the Negroes and Indians, for example, is not encouraging. We shall oppress the Chinamen, and their presence will make hoodlums or vagabonds of their oppressors. I therefore would consider with favor measures to discourage the Chinese from coming to our shores. President Hayes.
Subsection B. President Hayes and the Paraguay Prerogative. In 78, Hayes contributed to a peaceful land negotiation between Argentina and Paraguay over the Chaco territory. He awarded the territory to Paraguay, and there's a lot of stuff there named after him. The capital is named Presidente Hayes, which is like the name and title of a president, which is weird. You'd think they'd just like call it Hayestopia or something cool like that, but they didn't. Yeah, but he did that. He fixed that. Subsection C, in which a Frenchman must not be allowed to create the Panama Canal. Also at the time, the Panama Canal was sort of a worm in many people's brains. Like in 79, there was a dude, Ferdinand de Lesseps. He built the canal in the Suez Canal, the one in Egypt. Yeah, he did that one, and it was like, I have connected a sea to an ocean. Now I'm gonna be like ocean, and I'm gonna be the guy who connected 3 seas and an ocean, vice versa. But you get what I mean. He's a pretty cool dude, and he was trying to raise money to make that happen. And people in the United States were like, no, you can't have some foreigner do that, because they were scared of other people taking colonial power from the United States. Which Hayes wasn't really about that life, but at the same time, he want America's interests to be snatched from them. There had been some hanky-panky involving France and like Mexico and stuff, and they did not want that to become another thing with Panama, I guess, because this is important. This is the Panama Canal. This makes it so people don't have to go next to Argentina and Chile and all that other South America. They can just go right through the middle of America, through Panama. And one of the people who gets contracted onto it is a cabinet member of Hayes, Secretary of the Navy, Thompson. He was offered a position. He was offered a presidency of the board, presidency to be the head man of this project to build the canal. And it's important to note that this project never got anywhere, but it did get Thompson very, very fired, very much kicked to the curb. Hayes did not like that. And I guess that kind of probably hampered the cred that he gave the project in the first place. And, just ugly stuff, really. But it makes sense. It makes sense. Hayes is trying to protect America's interests, and he can't have cabinet members being so openly against him, Subsection Delta, in which Mexico invades the U.S. But speaking of being openly against, something beautiful happened. Something reflective of modern politics happened at the border between the United States and Mexico during Hayes' administration. So there were like straight up raids by organized bands of bandits into the United States. And Hayes did a couple of things. A, he sent down the troops to fix the problem. B, he ultimately allowed them to pursue into Mexico if need be. And C, and this is the important one, he figured stuff out with Mexico. He made an agreement. He didn't build a wall, unfortunately. We all know that would have fixed everything. That's just solution. These organized raiders, they would have totally been stopped by a wall, of course. Not have blown through it, burnt it down, knocked it down, anything like that. They just would they'd have just gone home empty-handed. They weren't starving or anything. But no, what he did was he talked with the president, the new leader of Mexico, and was like, hey, yo, we really need to work to be better about this, because I want to trade with Mexico and make good money on the American side, and you too. let's work together and make this better, and they did. Mexico fixed the problem. Mexico stabilized the region, or more than it was. And I think that's great. And I wish we could see more of that today, when we have so much less of a problem than that. Like, there are no military bans, like, just raiding. Like, there are criminaling at, like, the highest tier of criminal. But we don't have, like, organized raids for supplies and shit, just grabbing the resources and yeeting them across the border. On the backs of donkeys wearing sombreros, I guess. That's what they used to move the supplies they raided, right? Chapter 12, in which it's all about that money. Money, money, money. It's all about that money. All that President Hayes needed was the money. The hard money. And now, I might be assumed to be talking about his debts that he always managed to have after a stint of being a politician. But no, I'm talking about on a national scale. All he needed was that cold, gold goodness, as they call it. That hard money. None of them greenbacks, none of that paper, none of that silver. Get that silver out of here. Take it back to northwestern Spain, I apologize. Wrong part of Spain. Anyway, Hayes. Money, Hayes, silver money. That's what they want. That's what the senators are pushing for. The United States has a lot of silver. Gold, not as much gold, except in Dakota. Dakota has a lot of gold just then. Everywhere else, not a lot of gold, more silver. So Hayes doesn't like this. Hayes feels like ultimately this is going to defraud people and creditors and just not be good for the economy, because gold and silver have like different values, and gold tends to have more value than silver. And so when those values change and you have a coin that's $1 silver and then a coin that's $1 gold, the actual value of the coin that's $1 silver is going to be like less than $1 when your standard is $1 gold, right? Following me so far, people? Yeah, I'm more relaxed because I like talking about money. Money is easy. Money is simple. So, you got the Bland Silver Act. That's going to make silver minted coins a thing in this beloved country. And then it gets sort of redone into the Bland-Allison Act, which makes it like $2 to $4 million worth of coins minted every year. I think it's every year, or every quarter, or something stupid like that. Every cycle. That's not important. What's important is Hayes did eventually have to allow this to happen. They didn't give him a choice. Like, he vetoed it, and then they vetoed him by getting 2/3 majority vote. Yeah, fun stuff. But ultimately, he had no choice. But what he did do was mint coins that were $1 gold value, right? So they were the same value as a $1 gold coin, right? $1 of silver. Equal value to $1 of gold, which did not last forever because those values change with time, but it was a good effort for him to try it. He could have gone as far as 4 million, but he stuck to 2 million because he still didn't like it and didn't want it to happen. Money, money, money. If only he could see us today. There ain't no gold standard no more, son. The point is, that's Hayes, that's his money. That's his money in the bank. That's his gas in the tank, and that's how he does it. That's how he did it. That's how he made it happen. He also continued specie payments, which is worth noting, because specie payments are like repaying people with gold when they're like, I have this note from the government that is worth X amount. Gold, please. And he continued doing that as a way to honor that gold standard, right? Which is respectable. Because doing that is difficult. He had to acquire gold to do it. The government had to acquire gold to make this happen. Which is part of the reason they don't do gold standard as much as they used to. Chapter 13. The End of Office. After Hayes's presidency, at the end of it, he did a good job working with Andrew Garfield to set up his new presidency. There was not, as usually a lot of people lose their jobs when the presidency turns over, but Hayes did a lot of work to make sure that people who had just gotten their jobs weren't immediately losing them. There was one cabinet member who he worked with Garfield to make sure that he stayed. Basically, he needed the position filled, but didn't have a lot of time left in the actual presidential term. So he worked with Garfield to pick somebody who was decent for it. He was Secretary of the Navy, if I'm not mistaken. I forget his name. Some jabroni. He's important for the Garfield presidency, not for mine. Actually, Nathan Goff Jr. over here never managed to actually serve under Garfield because of some drama related to the Garfield administration. There was an attempt, as they say, but he never actually got to do it with Garfield. So, yeah. My Hayes presidency that I've lived in for the last 2 months. Hayes retired. He had a good retirement. He was always very active with charitable foundations. Always a huge backer of education. Always, always, always. He lived a good life. His wife died. He died. It was sad. Not too important to his presidency, though. During his retirement, he did a lot of charitable work, sat on a lot of boards, and was pretty influential in the state of Ohio in gleaning funds for different organizations and whatnots. Not hugely important to his presidency, probably important to his memory, especially in Ohio. You got to remember he's the guy who helped accrue funding to help support Ohio State back when it was the Ohio College of Mechanics and Farming or whatever it was, some stupid elaborate name. Chapter 14. Finish the video already, please. Oh. So, we've been over Hayes's whole career. We started with his governorship, his radical Republican years, for lack of a better way to say it. His service in the Civil War was distinguished. His service as a lawyer, I'd say, was pretty distinguished, though there were definitely more distinguished lawyers that he had to compete against in the political spectrum. There are not a lot of them that had more character than he did. We went over his policies, his push for civil service reform, his less important need to have less silver money in circulation, his even less important need to have portraits of his predecessors hanging around his office. You know how it is. But more importantly, we discussed both his Reconstruction efforts and his civil service reform. Now, it's easy to look at Hayes and see his Reconstruction and say, what a failure. And what a failure it really was. Reconstruction did not need to end the way it did. But because it did, we have suffered since, right? They let the KKK and the rifle clubs loose. And, you know, did a lot of damage to politics in the South, did a lot of damage to culture in the South, I think, and in the North. And it's a tragedy that I struggle to make words for because it's so complicated and awful. And I really think if they had kept troops in the South for a longer period of time and maybe used them more intelligently, then we could have had a different present, right? He had the power to affect the future of the United States. And I think the only real saving grace for Hayes as a character here is that, and I know he's not a character, he's a person, he was a real living person. He did it in good faith. He thought the people he was trying to work with in the South were going to honor the 14th, 15th Amendments, right? He thought they were going to uphold the rights of freedmen and protect the rights of freedmen, and they didn't. And that's pretty sad. Anytime when you look at a person putting his faith in other people and it doesn't work, it's sad. Because that's a loss for all of us, I think, in a lot of ways. Rutherford Hayes did something equally as important as Reconstruction ending, and that he gave the nation a push towards civil service reform. And I think that civil service reform should always be half of his legacy, because it's a big deal. Could you imagine a government that was as corrupt as it was before the 19th century, before the modern era? And I know there's corruption in the government today, but nothing as flagrant as what you see during Hayes' time. You're talking bold-faced stuff. You're talking, bribery that's endorsed by the government. That's essential to its function. That's about as bad as corruption gets. It's about as deep-seated as it can become. And it's a good thing we turned off of that path, because that is an ugly direction to go down. The more you allow for corruption to continue entirely unopposed, the worse it gets. And it benefited Hayes to just give in entirely to patronage. And there were times when he did. Like in the South, he definitely allowed Key to use patronage to get people campaigning for Hayes in the South, get people supporting Hayes. Didn't work as well as he would have liked, but... And, in New York, where you had Meeker, he tried to use a system of testing people into their office, and as soon as he had a bad candidate, he used that as an excuse to stop doing that entirely. Like, really, they tested somebody into the office, they were not accustomed to the type of work, they couldn't do the job, and so he just started picking people instead. My point is, Hayes was a pretty good president, with one really, really bad thing that he did. He stood up to both the Republicans of his day and the Democrats of his day. He fought for reform. He stood by his values, displayed a great deal of integrity over the course of his career. And unfortunately, during the process of that, also ended Reconstruction in the worst way possible. Thank you for your time, and peace be unto you, I guess. May your beard become excessively badass, and your top hat be dapper, and your honesty be on point every time so that people vote for you repetitively, consecutively in elections. And then when you promise to just run one term, you have to do it, because you're the honesty guy. You don't tell any lies. Okay.
We have upon the whole enjoyed our 4 years here, but the responsibility, the embarrassments, the heartbreaking sufferings which we can't relieve, the ever-present danger of scandals and crimes among those who we are compelled to trust, and 1,000 other drawbacks to our satisfaction and enjoyment by which we are constantly surrounded, leave us no place for regret upon retiring to the freedom, independence, and safety of our obscure and happy home in the pleasant grove at Fremont. Coming in, I was denounced as a fraud by all the extreme men of the opposing party, and as an ingrate and a traitor by the same class of men in my own party. Going out, I have had the good will, blessings, and approval of the best people of all parties and sections. I had a strong and comforting faith that I should be able to organize and conduct an administration which would satisfy and win the country. This faith has never deserted me. I had it before either the election or the nomination. Doubtless it was founded on my experience. I have often said that I never fail to gain the confidence and friendship of those I wish to win if I have the time and opportunity to do so. President Hayes.